Welcome to the world of the medieval siege, a story of stone, steel, and strategy. Now is the time to get comfortable. Find that perfect spot where your body feels most at ease. Let your head rest gently on your pillow and feel your shoulders relax, releasing the day. Take a slow, deep breath. Hold it for just a moment, and then let it all go. Where are you tuning in from? Is the moon your only companion in the quiet of the night? Or is the sun just starting its shift in your own perfectly managed kingdom? Whatever the hour, you are welcome here. If these stories bring you a little comfort, a simple follow or subscribe makes sure we can always find our way back to this quiet place. Now, as you settle into the stillness, let all other sounds fade. Listen. There is a new sound, one that does not belong to your world. It begins as a low rumble, a vibration you feel deep in your chest before you can truly hear it. It is the sound of 1,000 boots on the march, of engineers checking their ropes, and of a castle lord watching from his highest window as campfires flicker to life across the fields below. For 3 days, Rise had been a part of the landscape, a motionless figure tucked into a dense copse of fir trees on the high ridge. The chill of the morning still clung to the earth, making the wool of his cloak feel thin and useless against his skin. He shifted his weight, a slow, deliberate movement to ease the stiffness that had settled deep into his bones. His world had shrunk to this small patch of pine needles and the magnificent, defiant shape of Oak Haven Fortress across the valley. From this vantage point, he felt less like a man and more like a bird of prey, watching the movements of mice in a field, waiting for the perfect moment to understand their patterns. This patience was his trade, a skill honed over years of watching and waiting, knowing that a single overlooked detail could cost hundreds of men their lives. He unrolled a stiff piece of parchment, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet air, and picked up a stick of charcoal. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled for a moment before finding their familiar grip. He did not draw a simple outline of the castle. Instead, he tried to capture its character, its arrogance. As his eyes traced the line of the main keep, he felt a sympathetic ache in the back of his neck, an echo of the strain required to gaze up at its full height from the valley floor. He sketched the river that curled around the fortress's western flank, not as a simple blue line, but with short, urgent strokes that suggested the way the water pulled relentlessly at the reeds along its bank, a silent, powerful current that would sweep a man in full armor off his feet. This process was more than just observation. It was a way of knowing the enemy's home better than they knew it themselves. His attention then shifted to the great wooden gate, bound with thick bands of iron. Each morning, just after the first light touched the highest towers, he had heard its complaint, a deep, groaning sound that vibrated through the ground and up into his perch. It was the sound of immense weight, of timber seasoned for a generation, and he tried to capture that sense of heaviness in the dark, layered lines of his drawing. Below this sketch, he made a series of small, precise marks. Each mark represented a merchant's cart he had seen entering or leaving in the days before the Baron's army had sealed the valley. He counted 32. It was a good number, suggesting the larders and granaries inside were well stocked, a fact that would make his commander's face tighten with impatience. A well-fed fortress was a stubborn fortress. This count of supplies was followed by another set of observations. Riss watched the women. Every day, a small group would emerge from a smaller side gate or postern to collect water from a well just outside the castle's main defenses, nestled in a dip in the land. They laughed and talked, their voices too distant to be heard, but their relaxed postures told him this was a routine they considered safe. He noted their path, the number of buckets they carried, and the way the guards on the wall above them seemed to pay little mind to the daily chore. It was a vulnerability born of habit, a small crack in their discipline. Near his sketch of the well, he drew a tiny stick figure of a guard leaning on his spear, looking bored. A bored guard was a scout's best friend, a silent invitation to mischief. It was on the second day, as the afternoon light shifted, that he saw it. His eyes, weary from constant scanning, had almost missed it. On the southern wall, the one facing away from the main road and the river, was a patch of stone. It was a large, rough square of masonry, and the stones were a slightly paler, sandier color than the dark, weathered gray of the rest of the curtain wall. The mortar between them looked newer, less darkened by years of rain and lichen. He wondered about its story. Was it a repair after some long-forgotten siege? Or had a section of the original wall settled and been rebuilt by a mason with a different quarry? He couldn't be certain if the new stone was stronger or weaker than the old, a question that men with far more knowledge of engineering would have to debate. But its mere existence was a point of interest, an irregularity in a structure that relied on uniformity for its strength. He drew it with great care, shading the stones to show their different hue. The information he gathered felt like a physical weight in his pack when he finally decided his work was done. He had seen enough. Staying longer only increased the chance of a hunter or a wandering shepherd stumbling upon his hiding place. He moved with the silence of a fox, his feet finding purchase on soft earth and moss, avoiding the dry twigs that would snap and betray him. He did not think in terms of strategy or tactics. His mind was filled with the groan of the gate, the ache in his neck from looking at the tower, and the pale color of the patched southern wall. These were the details that mattered, the raw materials from which a siege was built. Knowledge was a weapon, and he was carrying an arsenal back to his baron. As he slipped back through the woods, the familiar scent of wood smoke and roasting meat from his own army's camp reached him. It was a crude smell, but it was the smell of safety, of a temporary home. He thought of the cook, a one-eyed man named Yorund, who claimed his stew could grow hair on a stone, though most of the men swore it was more likely to dissolve the spoon. The thought brought a rare smile to Riss's lips. The contrast between the grim fortress and the simple, earthy life of the camp was stark. One was a monument to permanence and defiance. The other, a temporary city of men who had come to break it. He found Baron Valerius in his command tent, a large pavilion of dark wool that smelled of leather and oiled steel. The Baron was a man whose presence filled the space, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his tunic. He listened without interruption as Riss spoke, his eyes fixed on the sketches spread across a rough-hewn table. He traced the patched section of the wall with a thick finger, his nail clicking softly on the parchment. He asked no questions about numbers or troop strengths, only about the sounds, the routines, the very feel of the place. He was a commander who understood that a fortress was more than stone. It was a community, a living thing with habits and weaknesses. "The patch," Valerius said, his voice a low rumble. "You are sure of the color?" Rhys nodded. "As sure as I am of the sunrise, my lord. It caught the light differently." The Baron stared at the drawing for a long time, lost in thought. He saw not just a wall, but a story of past damage, a potential flaw in an otherwise perfect defense. The scout's patient work had provided the first thread to pull. The rest would be up to engineers and soldiers, to the great machines of war, and the men who would die climbing the ladders. Rhys gave his report, omitting nothing, from the lazy guard at the well to the number of chickens he saw pecking in the outer yard. Every detail was a piece of a larger puzzle, and it was not his job to solve it, only to provide the pieces. When he finished, the Baron nodded once, a gesture of dismissal that was also a sign of approval. Rhys bowed and backed out of the tent, the weight of his mission finally lifting from his shoulders. His part, for now, was done. He had delivered his weapon, forged not of steel, but of observation and charcoal. He walked through the bustling camp, past men sharpening blades, mending harnesses, and arguing over dice. The harsh mix of sounds was a comfort after the profound silence of his ridge. He had been a shadow for 3 days, an unseen eye watching the life of Oakhaven. Now he was once more among his own people, a single soldier in a great forest of banners. Across the valley, from the walls of the fortress he now knew so intimately, the last glint of sunlight on a guard's helmet disappeared as the watch changed. Within Oakhaven, the sounds of evening preparations, of families gathering for a meal, echoed the ageless rhythm of a community settling in for the night, unaware of the storm that had finished its gathering. Summary. This section introduced the scout Rhys as he performed detailed reconnaissance on Oakhaven, focusing on gathering sensory and routine-based intelligence rather than just numbers, culminating in the discovery of a potential weakness in the castle wall. Rhys has successfully delivered his intelligence, including the crucial detail about the repaired wall, to his commander, Baron Valerius, setting the stage for the invading army to begin planning its siege. Lord Edmund stood on the highest parapet of Oakhaven, his knuckles white where he gripped the cold, weathered stone. The wind, finding its way through the crenellations, pulled insistently at his heavy woolen cloak, a constant reminder of the coming autumn and the greater storm that was gathering just beyond the horizon. He did not see simple blocks of granite and mortar when he looked at the walls. He saw the sweat of his grandfather's masons, the careful placement of each stone, a testament to a lifetime of planning. Below, the outer bailey, a wide courtyard usually filled with the orderly bustle of merchants and training squires, was now a swirling mass of humanity. This was a sight his grandfather had planned for, but one Edmund had always prayed he would never have to witness. His steward, Thomas, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with concern, came to stand beside him, his own gaze fixed on the scene below. "They are still coming, my lord," Thomas said, his voice low and steady despite the chaos they surveyed. He did not need to elaborate. From their vantage point, they could see the single road leading to the gate, a ribbon of brown earth choked with a slow-moving river of people. Families from the surrounding villages, their most precious belongings piled onto creaking handcarts or carried on their backs, flowed into the castle's embrace. This influx of people, seeking the safety of his walls, was both his duty and his greatest challenge. Thomas gestured with a gloved hand toward the granary, a stout stone building near the keep. "The harvest was good, my lord, better than most years." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air before adding the difficult truth. "But it was a harvest meant for the garrison and your household, not for 3 villages besides." Each new family that passed through the gate was another group of mouths to feed, another draw on the water, another body to shelter. Edmund watched a cooper shepherd his wife and small children through the throng, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They were his people, and their survival now rested entirely on the foresight of his ancestors and the decisions he would make in the coming days. Following this thought, Edmund turned his attention from the people to the castle's physical defenses. "Thomas, have the men raise the great chain across the river ford. I want it impassable by nightfall." This chain, a series of massive iron links anchored to stone pylons on either bank, was designed to stop any force from simply wading across the shallowest part of the river. He then pointed toward the 2 deep wells in the courtyard. "And post guards on the wells, 24 hours a day. Water will be rationed starting tomorrow morning. No one draws a drop without a steward's token." These were simple orders, but they marked a profound shift from a state of peace to one of siege, turning common resources into guarded treasures. As they walked the perimeter of the wall, the press of anxious humanity below gave way to the focused work of the garrison. Soldiers sharpened pikes, and boys no older than 15 ran bundles of arrows to the watchtowers. Their path eventually led them to the main gatehouse, where the castle blacksmith, a man with arms as thick as oak branches, was overseeing the reinforcement of the great wooden doors. He was using the last of the castle's iron bars to strengthen the gate's inner frame. The rhythmic clang of his hammer a defiant heartbeat against the growing silence of the countryside. It was a sound of strength and security, one that should have brought comfort. However, Thomas's worried expression told a different story. "My lord," he began carefully, "that is the last of the iron from the stores. If Master Elric uses it all on the gate—" He trailed off, knowing Edmund understood the implication. Iron was needed for everything. It was for repairing armor, for shoeing the few horses they had, and most importantly, for forging new arrowheads. A strong gate was essential, but a defense without the ability to strike back was a defense that would eventually fail. The blacksmith's hammer blows suddenly sounded less like defiance and more like a final, desperate act. Edmund was caught in a difficult position. He saw the logic in both choices. More arrowheads meant his archers could keep the enemy at bay for longer, perhaps thinning their numbers before they ever reached the walls. But if even one of those men reached a weakened gate with a battering ram, the arrowheads would be useless. He pictured the faces of his knights, men who believed in the power of a swift counterattack, and he knew they would argue for the arrows. Then he pictured the Cooper's family, huddled in a corner of the bailey, and knew their only hope was the unbreachable strength of the stone and wood around them. The choice represented more than just a matter of strategy. It was a choice between two different kinds of hope. One was the hope of an active, aggressive defense, the kind sung about in ballads. The other was the grim, silent hope of endurance, a reliance on stone, timber, and patience. The first path felt noble and familiar, the way of his ancestors. The second felt like a slow retreat, a hunkering down that bordered on admitting defeat before the first blow was even struck. He felt the weight of hundreds of lives resting on this single decision, a burden far heavier than any armor he had ever worn. "The gate, Thomas," Edmund said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Reinforce the gate until it is as strong as the mountain itself. We will make do with the arrows we have." He did not look at his steward as he spoke, instead keeping his eyes on the blacksmith, watching the sparks fly from the hot iron. He was choosing to trust in the legacy his grandfather had built, in the unyielding strength of Oakhaven's walls over the fleeting power of a volley of arrows. It was a commander's decision, one that could save them all or doom them utterly. The sharp, metallic sound of the hammer striking the iron seemed to echo his command, a final, ringing note of finality. As Edmund turned to walk back toward the keep, he felt a profound sense of isolation. The people in the bailey looked to him for salvation, his knights for leadership, and his steward for wisdom. Yet, in that moment, he felt utterly alone with the consequences of a choice that no one but he could have made. The faint clang of the blacksmith's hammer faded as he walked away, the sound of his decision lingering in the crisp air as he contemplated all that was to come. This part of the account detailed Lord Edmund's perspective as he prepared Oakhaven for a siege, showing the logistical and emotional strain caused by the influx of refugees and the difficult choices required in allocating finite resources like iron for defense. Lord Edmund has made a critical strategic decision, prioritizing the physical reinforcement of the castle gate over the production of new arrowheads, setting a defensive, enduring tone for the siege to come, and potentially creating tension with his more aggressive knights. Anwen had been given a small room in the weaver's loft, a space tucked high under the castle's eaves. From her narrow window, she could see the fields they had abandoned, now empty and waiting. The choice to seek refuge inside Oakhaven's walls had seemed simple when her father made it, a clear line between safety and danger. But as she watched the last of Lord Edmund's men raise the heavy iron chain across the river ford, a task that took 24 men straining at a great winch, she felt the walls not as a shield, but as the sides of a trap. Her family had brought their loom, dismantled and carefully wrapped, but there was no room to set it up. Its pieces lay in a corner, a silent reminder of a life that felt a world away, a life of rhythmic work and predictable days.
This quiet observation was shattered, not by a shout, but by a sound that seemed to crawl up from the earth itself. It was a long, deep note from a horn, unlike the clear, high calls of Oakhaven's watchmen. This one was raw and mournful, a beast's cry that made the small birds in the eaves scatter in frantic silence. Anwen pressed her hands against the cold stone of the window frame, her knuckles white. More sounds joined the first, a harsh mix of noises from horns of different shapes and sizes, some high and screeching, others low and guttural. It was not the coordinated call of a single army, but the clamor of many peoples, each announcing their arrival with their own brutal music. The discordant sound seemed to pull at the very stones of the castle, a promise of chaos to come. Following the sound, the first riders appeared over the ridge, their forms small against the gray sky. They were not a single column, but a spreading stain, a river of men and horses and wagons that flowed down into the valley. As they drew closer, Anwen's weaver's eye, trained to pick out color and pattern, saw not a unified force, but a patchwork of armies. She saw banners she recognized only from tapestries and cautionary tales her grandmother used to tell. There was the snarling red wolf's head of the northern mercenaries, a symbol of savagery. Nearby flew a banner with twin black axes on a field of green, the mark of the unforgiving hillfolk. Other flags were completely alien, bearing symbols and colors she could not name, each one representing a lord or a tribe that had answered Baron Valerius's call to war. The sheer variety of the force was more terrifying than a single disciplined army would have been. Anwen watched men in heavy mail marching next to warriors wearing little more than leather and fur, their arms bare to the chill wind. She heard shouts in languages that felt rough in her ears, full of hard sounds that had no place in the gentle speech of her village. These were not neighbors with a grievance. This was a gathering of strangers, pulled from distant mountains and shadowed forests, united only by their desire to see Oakhaven fall. Her father joined her at the window, his face a grim mask. "So many different peoples," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "It is as if the entire world has come to break down our door." As dusk began to settle, The true scale of their enemy became clear. Across the valley, 1,000 points of light flickered to life. The campfires of the besieging army spread from the riverbank to the edge of the woods, a sprawling city of fire that mocked the few lamps being lit within Oakhaven's walls. The sight made her breath catch in her throat. It was a vast and living thing, a carpet of angry stars that promised no rest. It was from this new city that a different sound began to rise with the darkness. It was the steady, relentless beat of drums, a low, pulsing rhythm that was less a sound and more a feeling, a vibration that traveled through the ground and up into the stone keep. The drumming continued through the night, a constant, menacing heartbeat that counted down the castle's last moments. Sleep became impossible for Anwen and many others. Every time she closed her eyes, the rhythm was there, a physical presence in the dark. Down in the crowded bailey, where families huddled together for warmth and comfort, the talk was of this new, terrifying enemy. People whispered about the hill folk, who were said to fight with a madness that made them ignore mortal wounds, and of the northern mercenaries, who were loyal only to the man who paid them the most gold. The stories, once distant and exciting, were now a source of deep, gnawing fear. Anwen watched as the faces of her fellow refugees changed. The initial hope that Lord Edmund's walls would be enough was beginning to curdle into something sour. People started to look at each other with suspicion. A cough in the dark was met with glares. A child's cry was answered with a harsh command to be silent, as if any sound from within might provoke the monster outside. The cultural bonds that held Oakhaven together began to fray under the pressure of so many different cultures pressing in from the outside. The enemy wasn't just at the gate. Their presence was a poison, seeping through the stone and turning the defenders against themselves.
One evening, a woman whose family had lived within the castle walls for generations snapped at Anwen's mother over a bucket of water. "You field folk don't understand," the woman hissed. "You brought this trouble with you. If you'd stayed to fight for your own lands, this army wouldn't be here." The accusation was unfair and born of terror, but the words stung, creating a divide between the castle-born and the refugees. The enemy's greatest weapon, Anwen realized, wasn't a sword or a siege engine. It was the visible, overwhelming proof that Oakhaven was alone. A small island of familiar faces surrounded by a vast and hostile sea of strangers. A sea that was already beginning to erode their foundations from within. The drumming never stopped. It became the new sound of life, a constant backdrop to the hushed conversations, the shortened rations, and the fearful glances toward the battlements. Anwen would sometimes press her ear to the stone wall of her small room, trying to feel the rhythm more clearly, as if understanding it might rob it of its power. But it remained alien, a heartbeat that was not her own, promising only an end to everything she had ever known. She found herself staring at the wrapped pieces of her loom, the smooth, familiar wood, a relic from another world. In those fleeting moments of silence between the changing of the guard, when the drums paused for a breath, she could almost forget the forest of hostile banners that now defined her world.
She could almost remember the simple feeling of thread passing through her fingers, the steady rhythm of her own work, the making of something whole and beautiful. But then the drumming would start again, and the memory would vanish like smoke, leaving only the cold stone and the sound of a breaking world. This account focused on the psychological impact of the diverse besieging army's arrival, as seen through the eyes of a young refugee, Anwen, showing how the visual and auditory intimidation tactics began to sow fear and internal cultural friction within Oakhaven's walls. The enemy is now fully encamped around Oakhaven, their constant drumming and visible diversity having successfully demoralized the inhabitants and created the first cracks in the community's social cohesion. Brother Michael's world had shrunk to the size of his small garden, a patch of defiant green tucked against the inner wall of the keep. His fingers, stained with earth, gently crushed a leaf of lemon balm, and the clean scent rose to meet him, a brief memory of a more peaceful world. For a moment, it was the only thing he could smell, a pure and simple truth in a place that was growing twisted. He spent his mornings here, among the neat rows of chamomile, yarrow, and feverfew, tending to the living things that asked for nothing but water and care. These plants were his allies against the unseen enemies of sickness and despair, but he knew his supplies were finite. Each plucked leaf was one less he would have for the days to come, a quiet counting down that mirrored the guard's watch on the walls. This quiet stewardship could not last, however, as his duties always pulled him back toward the heart of Oakhaven. As he left the garden, the ordered calm dissolved, replaced by the grating sounds of the main courtyard. The space, once a bustling hub of commerce, where farmers and merchants exchanged goods with easy familiarity, had changed. Now people gathered in tight, suspicious knots. Laughter was a forgotten currency, and the air carried not the aroma of baking bread, but the sharp edge of fear. He saw a woman clutch her children closer as a group of men-at-arms passed, their own faces drawn and tired. The community's spirit felt as strained as the bowstrings of the archers who watched from the battlements above. Ahead, a heated argument had erupted near the doors of the granary. Brother Michael recognized the baker's wife, a woman whose hands were perpetually dusted with flour, her voice normally warm and generous. Today it was shrill as she faced a farmer and his family, people who had fled their fields and sought refuge only weeks before. "You take what isn't yours," she accused, her finger jabbing toward a small sack at the farmer's feet. "That grain is for Oakhaven folk, not for every stray who appears at the gate." The farmer, a man whose shoulders were bowed from a lifetime of labor, stood his ground, his face a mask of weary anger. "My family starves the same as yours," he replied, his voice low and rough. "We are all under Lord Edmund's protection now. Does that protection not include a mouthful of bread?" This bitter exchange was a symptom of a deeper sickness. Other residents, long-time castle dwellers, murmured their support for the baker's wife, while the newer refugees looked on with a mix of defiance and fear. The line between us and them was no longer the stone wall of the castle. It was being drawn right through the middle of the courtyard. Brother Michael started to move toward them, his instinct to mediate taking over, But another incident drew his attention. Near the main well, a young squire, puffed with the importance of his master's household, shoved a commoner away from the bucket. "Water for the knights comes first," the boy declared, his voice cracking with unearned authority. The man, a tanner, with hands stained from his trade, stumbled back, his expression of shock quickly hardening into resentment. There was no physical blow thrown, but a bond of trust and mutual respect was broken as surely as if a sword had been drawn. The old order, where each person knew their place and their duties, was fraying under the constant pressure. Because of this, small resentments that would have been ignored in times of peace now festered into open hostility. Michael saw it everywhere, in the way people avoided eye contact, in the hoarding of small scraps of food, in the sudden silence that fell when someone from a different family or trade approached a conversation. Fear was a terrible acid, dissolving the ties that held them all together. He knew that a fortress was more than stone. It was the will of its people, and the will of Oakhaven's people was beginning to crack. He found the child he had been sent for in a crowded alcove that smelled of damp wool and unwashed bodies. The girl lay on a thin pallet, her forehead slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. Her mother looked at Michael with desperate eyes as he knelt. He placed a cool hand on the child's brow, feeling the heat of the fever. It was a simple ailment, one he could normally soothe with a brew of willow bark and a cool cloth, but his small store of bark was dwindling. As he worked, listening to the child's shallow breaths, he could hear the whispers from the families pressed in around them, words that carried their own kind of poison.
They were the same words he had heard in the courtyard. The talk was of outsiders from the villages using up our food, of farmers who surely had their own stores hidden away while castle-born folk went without. Each whispered accusation was another stone pulled from the foundation of their community. He offered the mother a small pouch of dried chamomile for a calming tea, a gesture that felt woefully inadequate. He wondered, with a growing sense of dread, how long they could possibly hope to fight the enemy at the gates when they were so busy making enemies of one another inside. The physical sickness he could try to combat, but the sickness of the spirit was a far more resilient foe. Later, as twilight began to bleed across the sky, he stood again at the edge of his garden, looking down into the courtyard. The arguments had subsided, replaced by a sullen, watchful quiet. Families cooked their meager evening meals over small, smoky fires, the smoke stinging his eyes even from this distance. They did not share their fires as they once would have. Instead, each family was an island, guarding what little it had. The space between them felt wider and colder than the few feet of cobbled stone that separated their blankets. The vibrant tapestry of Oakhaven life, weavers, bakers, smiths, farmers, was unraveling into a collection of loose, frayed threads. He thought of the banners Anwen had described seeing from her window, the snarling wolves and twin axes of the enemy. They were a force of many different peoples, united by a single purpose: to take this castle.
Inside the walls, however, the opposite was happening. The people of Oakhaven, once a single community, were fracturing into smaller and smaller pieces, each driven by the primal need for survival. The unity of the attackers seemed to mock the disarray of the defenders. A person might wonder if a wall is truly a defense if it only serves to trap the defenders with their own growing fears. The constant, low drumming from the enemy camp began again, a sound that had become the rhythm of their lives, the heartbeat of their confinement. It felt louder tonight, more insistent. It seemed to mock their internal squabbles, a reminder of the real threat that lay just beyond their sight. Brother Michael looked at his herbs, their leaves dark in the fading light, and then at the divided courtyard below. The shadow of the siege had fallen so completely upon their world that it had begun to live inside them, turning neighbor against neighbor in the encroaching dark. While the people of Oakhaven watched the slow strangulation of their world, the architect of that pressure, Master Ulrich, saw only a problem of angles and weight. His domain was a sprawling, chaotic field of felled trees behind the main army encampment, a place where the clean scent of pine sap and stripped bark mingled with the smell of sweat and hot metal from the nearby forges. He ran a calloused hand over a massive oak beam, feeling for the telltale dampness of green wood. All around him, teams of men worked with a noisy rhythm, their axes and adzes, a tool like an axe but with the blade set at a right angle to the handle, shaping the raw forest into the bones of war machines. Ulrich's world was not one of banners and glory, but of geometry and the honest properties of timber. This methodical world was soon interrupted. A shadow fell over the large parchment he had spread on a makeshift table, a diagram of a siege tower weighted down at the corners with smooth river stones. Sir Reynard, a young cavalry captain with a plume on his helmet that seemed too grand for the muddy conditions, stood over him. The captain's polished boots were an insult to the wood chips and dirt of Ulrich's workspace. He gestured impatiently toward the half-assembled wooden skeletons rising across the field. "Your work crawls, Master Engineer," Reynard said, his voice sharp. "My horse grows fat in its picket line, while your carpenters play with sticks. We should be at the walls by now." Ulrich did not look up from his plans immediately, a small act of defiance that asserted the importance of his own craft. He finished tracing a line with a piece of charcoal before slowly rolling the parchment closed. "These sticks, Sir Captain, will carry your men to those walls," he replied, his tone even and calm. "But if they are made from wood that is not given time to settle, they will twist. A siege tower that buckles is not a weapon, it is a tomb for 100 men." He tapped the great oak beam beside him. "This timber was a living tree a week ago. It still weeps. Haste will make it weak." The captain's face hardened, his pride clearly stung by the engineer's cool logic. "My men are not afraid of risk. They are warriors, not carpenters waiting for sap to dry. The Baron grows impatient. A swift, bold assault is what is needed to break their spirit, not this endless hammering." Reynard's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, a gesture that spoke of a world where problems were solved with a single, decisive action. For him, the fortress was an opponent to be challenged head-on, a matter of courage and steel. He could not grasp that the true enemy was gravity, torsion, and the slow, unforgiving passage of time. Ulrich found himself arguing not for his own reputation, but for the fundamental truths of his profession. He knew the type of man Reynard was, one who believed that bravery alone could conquer any obstacle. Courage cannot stop a 60-foot tower from collapsing under its own weight, Sir Captain, nor can it make a throwing arm fling a stone true if the wood warps. This is not a cavalry charge. This is a conversation with stone, and it must be conducted with patience. The dismissal in the captain's eyes told Ulrich that his words were wasted. Reynard saw caution as cowardice, and engineering as a lesser, grubby art compared to the noble clash of swords. This left Ulrich with a difficult choice. To follow the captain's demands would be to knowingly construct flawed machines, sending men to their deaths and likely failing the entire siege. Yet, to openly defy a high-ranking knight was a dangerous path for a man whose authority came from his knowledge, not his birth. He watched Reynard stride away toward the command tents and felt a familiar knot of frustration. He had seen this before. Commanders eager for a quick victory, blind to the slow, grinding work required to achieve it. He knew then that he could not let the matter rest, for the lives of the soldiers who would use his creations were his responsibility too. Therefore, with a heavy sigh, he wiped his hands on his leather apron and made his way toward the center of the camp, seeking an audience with the one man who could overrule the captain's arrogant haste. Baron Valerius's tent was a small city of its own, surrounded by guards and buzzing with the activity of messengers and squires. Standing before it, Ulrich felt the social gulf that separated him from men like Reynard. He was a master of his craft, respected for his unique skills, but he was still a commoner petitioning a lord. The guards looked at him with disinterest, his sawdust-covered clothes marking him as a laborer, not a warrior. Inside, Baron Valerius sat at a heavy table, studying a map that showed the familiar outlines of Oakhaven. Ulrich explained the situation simply, without accusation, focusing only on the wood. He described how green timber shrinks and shifts as it dries, how joints loosen, and how the precise balance of a trebuchet's counterweight could be thrown off by this simple natural process. He spoke not of his conflict with the captain, but of the integrity of the machines themselves. "My lord," he concluded, "haste will give them a pile of broken wood at the base of their wall. Patience will give them a breach they cannot mend." The Baron listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. He was an older man, and his gaze held a weariness that suggested he had seen many sieges before this one. He understood that war was not won by passion alone. "Sir Reynard is young," the Baron said finally, a statement that was both an explanation and a dismissal. "He sees the glory of the finish line, but not the terrain of the race. You will have your time, Master Ulrich. Ensure your wolves have teeth when they are finally unleashed. The captain will be given other duties." Ulrich gave a short, grateful bow and departed the tent, a sense of relief washing over him. He had won the argument and secured the time he needed. However, as he walked back toward the sounds of his workshop, he caught the glare of Sir Reynard, who stood talking with other knights nearby. The captain's look was one of pure enmity, a cold promise of future trouble. Ulrich had protected his work and the men who depended on it, but in doing so, he had made a powerful enemy in a camp where alliances could be as vital as strong timber. He returned to his field of wood and noise, the argument already fading as he refocused on the tasks at hand. He instructed a team to begin fitting soaked animal hides over the forward-facing timbers of a siege tower, a slow, smelly process of nailing wet leather that, once dried, provides some protection against the flaming arrows of the defenders. This was a technique as old as the machines themselves, a simple answer to a fiery problem. He saw one of his foremen struggling to calculate an angle for a support strut and went over to help, scratching the correct lines in the dirt with a stick. For a moment, he forgot the politics of the camp and lost himself in the comforting certainty of his work. Unlike the shifting loyalties of men, the principles of leverage and tension were constant. They did not care for a man's rank or his ambitions. He found a strange peace in the logic of it all, the way each joint and peg had a purpose, contributing to a whole far greater than its parts. He even shared a brief, rough joke with the carpenters about a crooked beam resembling a certain cavalry captain, drawing a few gruff chuckles from the men. The work continued as the day drew to a close, the pace steady and methodical. The half-finished engines stood like sleeping giants against the fading light, their shadows stretching long toward the defiant fortress in the distance. Ulrich felt a deep satisfaction in the slow, tangible progress. Each perfectly fitted joint was a small victory, each secured beam a step closer to the inevitable conclusion. He knew that the stone walls of Oakhaven would not be broken by a single glorious charge, but by the relentless application of pressure, engineered with patience and an understanding of the unyielding laws of the physical world. As Ulrich finally prepared for rest in his small tent near the construction site, he listened to the rhythmic thud of mallets on wood from the night crew. It was a sound of steady progress, a mechanical heartbeat that promised a slow but certain end to the standoff. He closed his eyes, the familiar noise a strange and reassuring comfort in the tense quiet of the waiting army. While the people of Oakhaven watched the slow strangulation of their world, the architect of that pressure, Master Ulrich, saw only a problem of angles and weight. His domain was a sprawling, chaotic field of felled trees behind the main army encampment, a place where the clean scent of pine sap and stripped bark mingled with the smell of sweat and hot metal from the nearby forges. He ran a calloused hand over a massive oak beam, feeling for the telltale dampness of green wood. All around him, teams of men worked with a noisy rhythm, their axes and adzes, a tool like an axe, but with the blade set at a right angle to the handle, shaping the raw forest into the bones of war machines. Ulrich's world was not one of banners and glory, but of geometry and the honest properties of timber. This methodical world was soon interrupted. A shadow fell over the large parchment he had spread on a makeshift table, a diagram of a siege tower weighted down at the corners with smooth river stones. Sir Reynard, a young cavalry captain with a plume on his helmet that seemed too grand for the muddy conditions, stood over him. The captain's polished boots were an insult to the wood chips and dirt of Ulrich's workspace. He gestured impatiently toward the half-assembled wooden skeletons rising across the field. "Your work crawls, Master Engineer," Reynard said, his voice sharp. "My horse grows fat in its picket line while your carpenters play with sticks. We should be at the walls by now." Ulrich did not look up from his plans immediately, a small act of defiance that asserted the importance of his own craft. He finished tracing a line with a piece of charcoal before slowly rolling the parchment closed. "These sticks, Sir Captain, will carry your men to those walls," he replied, his tone even and calm. "But if they are made from wood that is not given time to settle, they will twist. A siege tower that buckles is not a weapon. It is a tomb for 100 men." He tapped the great oak beam beside him. "This timber was a living tree a week ago. It still weeps. Haste will make it weak." The captain's face hardened, his pride clearly stung by the engineer's cool logic. "My men are not afraid of risk. They are warriors, not carpenters waiting for sap to dry. The Baron grows impatient. A swift, bold assault is what is needed to break their spirit, not this endless hammering." Reynard's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, a gesture that spoke of a world where problems were solved with a single decisive action. For him, the fortress was an opponent to be challenged head-on, a matter of courage and steel. He could not grasp that the true enemy was gravity, torsion, and the slow, unforgiving passage of time. Ulrich found himself arguing, not for his own reputation, but for the fundamental truths of his profession. He knew the type of man Reynard was, one who believed that bravery alone could conquer any obstacle. "Courage cannot stop a 60-foot tower from collapsing under its own weight, Sir Captain," Ulrich stated plainly. "Nor can it make a throwing arm fling a stone true if the wood warps. This is not a cavalry charge. This is a conversation with stone, and it must be conducted with patience." The dismissal in the captain's eyes told Ulrich that his words were wasted. Reynard saw caution as cowardice, and engineering as a lesser, grubby art compared to the noble clash of swords. This left Ulrich with a difficult choice. To follow the captain's demands would be to knowingly construct flawed machines, sending men to their deaths and likely failing the entire siege. Yet to openly defy a high-ranking knight was a dangerous path for a man whose authority came from his knowledge, not his birth. He watched Reynard stride away toward the command tents and felt a familiar knot of frustration. He had seen this before. Commanders eager for a quick victory, blind to the slow, grinding work required to achieve it. He knew then that he could not let the matter rest, for the lives of the soldiers who would use his creations were his responsibility too. Therefore, with a heavy sigh, he wiped his hands on his leather apron and made his way toward the center of the camp, seeking an audience with the one man who could overrule the captain's arrogant haste. Baron Valerius's tent was a small city of its own, surrounded by guards and buzzing with the activity of messengers and squires. Standing before it, Ulrich felt the social gulf that separated him from men like Reynard. He was a master of his craft, respected for his unique skills, but he was still a commoner petitioning a lord. The guards looked at him with disinterest, his sawdust-covered clothes marking him as a laborer, not a warrior. Inside, Baron Valerius sat at a heavy table, studying a map that showed the familiar outlines of Oakhaven. Ulrich explained the situation simply, without accusation, focusing only on the wood. He described how green timber shrinks and shifts as it dries, how joints loosen, and how the precise balance of a trebuchet's counterweight, the part of the machine that provides the force to throw the stone, could be thrown off by this simple, natural process. He spoke not of his conflict with the captain, but of the integrity of the machines themselves. My lord, he concluded, haste will give them a pile of broken wood at the base of their wall. Patience will give them a breach they cannot mend. The Baron listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. He was an older man, and his gaze held a weariness that suggested he had seen many sieges before this one. He understood that war was not won by passion alone. Sir Reynard is young, the Baron said finally, a statement that was both an explanation and a dismissal. He sees the glory of the finish line, but not the terrain of the race. You will have your time, Master Ulrich. Ensure your wolves have teeth when they are finally unleashed. The captain will be given other duties. Ulrich gave a short, grateful bow and departed the tent, a sense of relief washing over him. He had won the argument and secured the time he needed. However, as he walked back toward the sounds of his workshop, he caught the glare of Sir Reynard, who stood talking with other knights nearby. The captain's look was one of pure enmity, a cold promise of future trouble. Ulrich had protected his work and the men who depended on it, but in doing so, he had made a powerful enemy in a camp where alliances could be as strong timber. He returned to his field of wood and noise, the argument already fading as he refocused on the tasks at hand. He instructed a team to begin fitting soaked animal hides over the forward-facing timbers of a siege tower, a slow, smelly process of nailing wet leather that, once dried, provides some protection against the flaming arrows of the defenders. This was a technique as old as the machines themselves, a simple answer to a fiery problem. He saw one of his foremen struggling to calculate an angle for a support strut and went over to help, scratching the correct lines in the dirt with a stick. For a moment, he forgot the politics of the camp and lost himself in the comforting certainty of his work. Unlike the shifting loyalties of men, the principles of leverage and tension were constant. They did not care for a man's rank or his ambitions. He found a strange peace in the logic of it all, the way each joint and peg had a purpose, contributing to a whole far greater than its parts. He even shared a brief, rough joke with the carpenters about a crooked beam resembling a certain cavalry captain, drawing a few gruff chuckles from the men. The work continued as the day drew to a close, the pace steady and methodical. The half-finished engines stood like sleeping giants against the fading light, their shadows stretching long toward the defiant fortress in the distance. Ulrich felt a deep satisfaction in the slow, tangible progress. Each perfectly fitted joint was a small victory, each secured beam a step closer to the inevitable conclusion. He knew that the stone walls of Oakhaven would not be broken by a single glorious charge, but by the relentless application of pressure, engineered with patience and an understanding of the unyielding laws of the physical world. As Ulrich finally prepared for rest in his small tent near the construction site, he lay listening to the rhythmic sound of axes shaping wood from the night crew. It was a noise of deliberate creation, a steady pulse that promised a slow but certain end to the standoff, and it offered a strange comfort in the vast, tense silence of the waiting army. From his position on the highest parapet, Lord Edmund watched the enemy camp transform. The sprawling collection of tents and cook fires had become a work site, and from it rose the skeletal arms of great wooden beasts. He squinted, the glare from the open fields making his eyes water as he tried to make sense of the strange constructions. They were not siege towers or simple catapults like the ones his father had taught him to defend against. These were different, with long swinging arms and massive counterweights. His men called them trebuchets, a foreign word for a foreign kind of war, whispered among the archers who had seen them used in the southern campaigns. This new threat had ignited a fire in his younger knights. Sir Callan, his face flushed with a mix of excitement and indignation, approached him now, his polished steel gauntlets clenching and unclenching. "My lord," he began, his voice tight, "they build these machines openly, mocking us. Give the command, a sally at dawn. We will ride out as your father did at Blackwater Ford, burn their engines, and be back before they can muster a proper defense." He spoke of honor and a glorious charge, words that felt both familiar and strangely distant. Edmund looked from Callan's eager face to the half-finished engines, wondering if the kind of courage their fathers had possessed was still the kind that could win a war. Instead of answering the knight immediately, Edmund descended from the battlements, the stone steps cool even through his boots, and sought the counsel of another man. He found Alaric, his master mason, not in the great hall, but by the southern wall, running a gnarled hand over the stonework. Alaric was a man of 70 years, his skin as wrinkled as dried fruit, and he had served Edmund's father before him. He did not speak of glory, but of stress and sheer. "A charge is for men, my lord," Alaric said, his voice raspy with stone dust. "Those things yonder, they are for walls. They do not tire, and they do not feel fear." Alaric unrolled a piece of scraped parchment on a nearby barrel, holding it down with a chipped stone. On it were sketches, not of battle formations, but of angles and layers. "The old way is to make the wall hard," the mason explained, tapping a drawing of their curtain wall. "But a stone from one of those machines will shatter the hardest surface. A fast horse can be stopped by a strong shield, but a river is stopped by a soft bank of earth." He proposed something that felt entirely wrong: to build huge sloping mounds of earth and timber against the inside of the walls. Instead of meeting force with force, he suggested they should absorb it, to smother the blow like a thick blanket. The choice presented to Edmund was a chasm between two worlds. On one side stood Sir Calin and the traditions of chivalry, a legacy of brave men on horseback winning the day with swift, decisive action. It was a world he understood, a world of songs and legends. On the other side was Alaric's quiet wisdom, a strategy of dirt and sweat, of labor instead of combat. It was an unglamorous, patient defense for a new, impersonal kind of assault. To choose Alaric's path was to admit that the old songs no longer told the whole truth of war, a concession that felt like a betrayal of his ancestors. He gathered his captains in the armory, the air tasting of oil and whetstones. When he gave the command, it was not the one they expected. "We will not ride out," Edmund stated, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "Every man able to lift a spade or carry a timber will begin reinforcing the walls from within. We will build earthen ramps, as Master Alaric has designed." A stunned silence followed, so complete he could hear the faint drip of water in a corner of the room. He saw the disbelief on their faces, the way their shoulders slumped. Sir Calin was the first to speak, his voice betraying a deep hurt. "You would have us hide behind dirt? Have knights do the work of laborers? There is no honor in it, my lord. We will be a laughingstock." Murmurs of agreement spread through the gathered men. They looked at each other, then back at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and contempt. They saw a commander choosing fear over courage, caution over action. He was asking them to fight a siege, not with swords, but with shovels. Edmund did not raise his voice. He simply met their gazes, one by one, feeling the immense weight of their collective disapproval. "Honor will not keep a thrown stone from breaching our walls," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. "Your fathers fought the wars of their time. We must fight the war of ours. We will not give the enemy the glorious battle they expect. We will give them a pile of rock and dirt they cannot break." He knew his reasoning was sound, but the logic did little to soothe the sting of their silent judgment. He was their lord, and they would obey, but their trust in him had been shaken. He left them there and walked back to the battlements alone. Below, he could see the first work parties being organized, men grabbing picks and spades with a reluctance that was plain even from this distance. A knight stood over a group of farmers, directing them not in a drill of arms, but in how to brace a timber frame. The familiar sounds of the castle, the clang of the blacksmith, the calls of the sentries, were being replaced by the dull thud of earth being tamped and the rasp of saws cutting through wood. He wondered if he had made the right choice. Was it better to risk everything in a single brilliant moment of defiance, or to endure a slow, grinding defense that chipped away at the spirits of his men? The enemy's great machines were a statement, a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. His response had to be a statement of its own. He was choosing to live, to endure, to trust in the resilience of stone and earth over the fleeting glory of a cavalry charge. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows from the merlons, the shape of Alaric's vision began to emerge. Against the cold, hard stone of the inner wall, a softer, darker line of packed earth was slowly rising. It was ugly, crude, and entirely without brace. Yet, as he watched a line of men, knights, and stable hands working side by side, passing buckets of soil, he felt a flicker of something new. It was not the soaring pride of a coming battle, but the stubborn hope of a foundation being laid. The arguments of the morning had left a bitter film in his throat, but the weary work of securing Oakhaven's future was now underway. The new day did not begin with the sound of a horn or a shout, but with a low, groaning complaint that carried across the morning mist from the enemy lines. On the south wall, Cale, a young archer barely old enough to grow a proper beard, felt his stomach tighten at the noise. He and the other men on the battlements had come to know it well. It was the sound of Master Ulrich's great timber beasts waking up, the ones the soldiers called trebuchets. These massive stone throwers were a new and terrible invention, and their presence had changed the feel of the siege from a contest of men to a punishment from an angry god. Cale rested a hand on the cool, rough stone of the parapet, the same stone his grandfather had helped lay, and felt a tremor of anticipation that had nothing to do with courage. That initial groan was followed by a sharp crack, like a giant's whip, and then a strange new sound began. It was a high, thin whistle that grew into a piercing scream as something vast and dark climbed into the sky, blotting out the sun for a brief moment. Cale didn't need to be told to duck. He and the others flattened themselves against the merlons, the stone crenellations of the wall, making themselves as small as possible. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as the scream reached its peak, ending in an impact that was more felt than heard. The entire wall shuddered, a deep, bone-jarring shock that vibrated up through the soles of his boots and into his teeth. Dust and small chips of stone rained down, and Cale tasted grit on his tongue as he cautiously raised his head to look. Far below, a section of the outer bailey wall had a fresh, pale scar, a crater of pulverized rock where the stone had struck. He could see the distant figures of the enemy engineers moving around their machine, too far away for any arrow to reach. This helplessness was the worst part. He was an archer, trained his whole life to send death on a feathered shaft. Yet his enemies were beyond his reach. They could strike with impunity, speaking a language of destruction that Oakhaven had no way to answer. All he could do was watch, wait for the next scream, and hope it was not his section of the wall that would be torn apart. Consequently, his role shifted from that of a soldier to a mere spectator in his own potential demise. While Kyle witnessed the assault from above, Elara, the wife of a stonemason, experienced it from deep within the castle's belly. Her world was a small, cramped cellar, its air smelling of damp earth, stored turnips, and the fear of the 3 families huddled within. They could not see the enemy, nor the great engines of war. They could only feel them. The distant groan of the wood was a muffled rumble through the packed ground, a prelude to the terror that followed. Her two small children were pressed against her, their faces buried in her skirts, and she held them tight with each approaching scream. She tried humming a tune to cover the noise, but the sound cut through everything. The impact, when it came, was not a sharp crack, but a profound, resonant thud that seemed to pass through the very foundations of the world. The ground beneath them would heave, and dust would sift down from the ceiling timbers above, catching in the single beam of light from a high, narrow slit in the wall. Alara's husband had explained the physics of it to her once, how the force of the blow traveled through the stone, seeking the path of least resistance. To her, it felt more personal, like a giant pounding a fist against their door, demanding to be let in. Her youngest child, Liam, would whimper with each tremor, and she would whisper reassurances she did not feel herself, her own heart a frantic drum against her ribs.
This terrifying conversation of stones continued throughout the day, a relentless rhythm of scream and shudder. The defenders on the walls developed a grim understanding of the enemy's methods. The machines were not aimed randomly. They focused their terrible power on one section of the wall at a time, patiently, tirelessly hammering the same spot. Lord Edmund had ordered men to pile earth and timber against the threatened wall, hoping to absorb the shocks, but it was slow, exhausting work. Cale watched the masons and laborers toiling below, their faces smudged with dirt and sweat, and felt a new kind of respect for them. They were fighting the siege with shovels and courage, a battle far less glorious than his own, but perhaps more vital. Then, in the mid-afternoon, the nature of the conversation changed. A different sort of projectile was launched. It made a softer, wetter sound as it flew, and it landed not with a crash of stone on stone, but with a sickening, heavy thud in the middle of the market square. There was a moment of confused silence from those who saw it, followed by shouts of disgust and horror that quickly spread throughout the castle. Cale leaned over the parapet, trying to see what had caused the commotion. He saw people scattering, their hands over their mouths and noses, pointing at a dark, misshapen lump lying near the central well. It took him a long moment to understand that it was the carcass of a cow, swollen and discolored with disease. Down in her cellar, Ilara knew something had changed by the sounds from the courtyard above. The panicked shouts were different from the disciplined calls of the guards. A man from another family sent to fetch water came scrambling back down the ladder, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He told them what had landed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and revulsion. It was not just an animal, it was a message. This was a new kind of warfare, one that did not seek to simply break walls of stone, but to break the people within them through sickness and despair. The enemy was not just attacking their fortress, they were poisoning their home from the inside. The reality of this act settled over Ilara like a shroud. This was not a contest between lords or a battle for land fought by soldiers according to some code of honor. This was something else entirely, something vile and without rules. She hugged her children tighter,
trying to shield them from a world that had suddenly become much darker. What kind of men would use sickness as a weapon? What sort of commander would order his soldiers to fling pestilence at women and children? The thought curdled in her mind, turning the distant, faceless enemy into something monstrous, something that deserved no mercy or understanding. On the wall, Kyle felt a similar shift within himself. He had been trained to respect an opponent, to see the man at the other end of his arrow as another soldier doing his duty. But as he watched men in leather aprons cautiously approach the carcass with long poles, preparing to haul it away to a fire pit, his perception of the enemy hardened into something cold and brittle. They were not soldiers. They were a relentless, faceless force of destruction. They were a plague upon the land, and his role was not to fight them, but to exterminate them. The frustration of his useless bow faded, replaced by a deep, burning hatred that felt heavier and more dangerous than any stone. The work of clearing the carcass was slow and hazardous. Brother Michael directed the effort, insisting the men cover their faces with cloth and wash thoroughly with lye soap afterward, though there was precious little of that left. The air in the courtyard carried a faint, sweet, and rotten smell that made people hurry past, their gazes averted. The well was declared unclean until it could be properly scoured, forcing everyone to the smaller, slower wells in the inner bailey. This created more friction, more arguments, and more strain on a community already stretched to its breaking point. Baron Valerius had thrown one stone, one dead animal, and had sown more discord than a dozen direct hits on the wall.
As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers across the battered courtyard, the terrible groaning from the enemy camp ceased. The bombardment was over for the day. A tense quiet fell over Oakhaven, a silence that was not peaceful but full of anxious listening. Every normal sound, a cough, a closing door, a crying baby, seemed amplified in the stillness. Men on the walls stood straighter, their eyes scanning the fields for any sign of a ground assault that might follow the day's violent negotiation. For Kyle, the end of the bombardment brought only the weary duty of the evening watch. He checked the string of his yew longbow, the familiar tension a small comfort in his hands. He ran a thumb over the feathers of his arrows, ensuring they were straight and true. This routine, the simple and repetitive work of a soldier, was an anchor in the swirling chaos of the day. He did not have to think about the shaking walls or the poisoned well, only about the worn grip of his bow and the precise notch for the string. His world shrank to these small, manageable tasks, and in them he found a measure of control. Down below, in the flickering lamplight of the cellar, Ilara did much the same. She portioned out the meager evening meal of thin oat gruel
and a slice of dried apple for each of her children, her movements practiced and calm. She told them a familiar story, her voice low and steady, about a clever fox and a foolish rabbit, a tale her own mother had told her. The children, exhausted by the day's terror, slowly grew quiet, their fears soothed by the simple magic of a well-loved story and a full, if not satisfied, belly. As true darkness fell outside, Ilara held her sleeping son, finding a fragile peace in the familiar, steady rhythm of his breathing against her chest. The great stone throwers, the machines they called trebuchets, had fallen silent. For 3 days, their rhythmic groan and shattering release had been the heartbeat of Oakhaven's suffering. Now, an unnatural quiet had settled over the fields between the castle and the enemy camp, a stillness that felt more menacing than the noise it replaced. It was in this silence that Lord Edmund called for Sir Gareth. He did not need to speak the command. The weight of his gaze was enough. Gareth, his most trusted knight, would go. He accepted the folded white banner from his lord's hand, the clean linen feeling impossibly fragile, a whisper of peace in a world that only screamed of war. As he rode his tired mare through the main gate, he felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on his back, each one laden with a desperate, unspoken hope that he knew he could not possibly fulfill. The short distance across the churned earth felt like a journey to another world. The ground, once green pasture, was now a ruin of mud, splintered wood, and the dark, unsettling stains of the diseased carcasses the enemy had thrown over the walls. Gareth kept his eyes forward, focusing on the forest of banners ahead. The air, free from the dust of crumbling mortar, carried different scents now. The sharpness of wood smoke from 1,000 campfires, the animal smell of horses and unwashed men, and faintly the aroma of roasting meat. The smell twisted in his gut, a reminder of the full bellies on one side of this conflict and the gnawing emptiness on the other. He was no longer a defender on a wall, but a solitary figure moving toward the heart of the beast, the white flag on his lance the only thing keeping the archer's arrows in their quivers. As he drew near, 2 guardsmen whose helmets were fashioned in the shape of snarling wolves rode out to meet him. Their movements were confident, their gear well-oiled and free of the rust that plagued Oakhaven's defenders. They spoke a northern dialect, their words clipped and hard as they escorted him into the sprawling camp. It was not a place of chaos, but of grim order. Men were mending harnesses, sharpening blades on whetstones, and moving with a purpose that spoke of a well-supplied, confident army. The sounds were a harsh mix of shouted commands and the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, so different from the weary murmurs and prayers that now filled Oakhaven's courtyards. This was not a temporary camp. It was a city of war, built to wait. The guards led him not to a simple tent, but to a pavilion of dark wool, large enough to hold a lord's entire court. Inside, the ground was covered with thick carpets from some distant land. their intricate patterns a stark contrast to the muddy ground just outside the flap. A heavy oak table stood in the center, laden with maps held down by polished stones. Baron Valerius sat behind it, not in armor, but in a fine tunic, his face calm and unreadable. He was younger than Gareth had imagined, his authority resting not in age or brute strength, but in an unnerving stillness. The comfort in the tent was a weapon in itself, a silent declaration of power and resources that made the deprivation within Oakhaven feel all the more hopeless. Valerius gestured to a stool, and a servant poured a cup of deep red wine for Gareth, a courtesy that felt more like a test than a kindness. The Baron spoke first, his voice even. "You have held out longer than I expected, Sir Knight. Your lord is a stubborn man." Gareth's hand was steady as he took the cup, though his throat felt tight. He would not show weakness. "Lord Edmund is a loyal man," he corrected, his own voice sounding rough in the quiet of the tent. "He holds this castle in fealty to his king." They exchanged a few more words, each one carefully chosen, a polite dance that circled the brutal reality of their situation, before Valerius finally leaned forward, his eyes holding Gareth's. "Let us speak plainly. I grow tired of this waiting."
With the same calm tone he might use to discuss the weather, Baron Valerius laid out his terms. There would be no sack, no fires, no harm to the common folk within the walls. They would be allowed to keep their homes and their lives under his rule. The castle's treasury, its armory, and its granaries would be his. And Lord Edmund, as a traitor to the Baron's cause, would be surrendered for a swift and public execution. The words landed in the airless tent with the force of a physical blow. Gareth felt a cold dread spread through his chest, and the wine he had just sipped turned to acid in his stomach. He had expected harsh terms, a great ransom, a forfeiture of land. He had not expected this. This was not a negotiation. It was a demand for his lord's life in exchange for the lives of his people. Gareth found his voice, arguing with a desperation he could not conceal. He spoke of the codes of chivalry, of the honor that was supposed to bind men of their station. He offered ransom, suggesting every coin in Edmund's coffers, every jewel his wife possessed. He proposed that his lord could be exiled, sent away forever, his lands forfeit, but his life spared. There is no honor in executing a man who has fought bravely, Gareth insisted, his plea hanging in the space between them. He searched the Baron's face for any sign of hesitation, for some flicker of shared understanding of the world as it should be, a world where loyalty and courage were rewarded, not punished with a hangman's rope. The Baron listened patiently, his fingers steepled before him, his expression unchanged. When Gareth finished, there was a long silence. "Honor did not build my siege engines, Sir Gareth," Valerius said, his voice soft but edged with steel. "And honor will not hold these lands for me when my army leaves." He explained it simply, as a master would to a student. Edmund's death was not a matter of vengeance, but of strategy. A living, exiled lord would be a symbol for rebellion, A dead one would be a lesson. Your people will have a new master, a peaceful one, if the old one is removed. That is my mercy. It is the only mercy I will offer." He then stood, a clear signal that the conversation was over.
The ride back was a torment. The world outside the pavilion seemed muted, the landscape drained of color. Every step his mare took was a step closer to the moment he would have to speak, to deliver the poison he now carried. The weight of the Baron's words pressed down on him, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. He saw the faces of the people in his mind. The baker's wife, who had given him a small, hard piece of bread that morning with a hopeful smile. The young archer, Kael, whose eyes were old with weariness. The children playing quiet, listless games in the shadow of the keep. He was carrying their lives in his hands, balanced against the life of the one man to whom he had sworn his undying loyalty. He wrestled with the choice, his thoughts a chaotic storm. What if he lied? What if he returned and said the Baron offered nothing but the sword? It would be the easier path for him. No one would question it. The castle would fight on, and they would all die together, their honor intact. But they would die. Starvation would claim the children first. Then the sickness would take more, and the final assault would take the rest. To withhold the offer was to condemn them all. Yet to present it was an act of betrayal in itself. He would be standing before his lord, the man who had knighted him, and laying out the terms of his surrender and death. It was a choice between two profound failures, two different ways of breaking every vow he had ever made. As the gates of Oakhaven loomed before him, he looked up at the sentries on the wall. Their faces, thin and drawn, turned to him, filled with a fragile, desperate hope. He saw in them not just defenders of a fortress, but fathers, sons, and husbands. He thought of Lord Edmund waiting in the great hall, a man who trusted him completely. In that moment, Gareth understood that words were the heaviest weapons of all. He could use them to preserve an idea of honor that would lead to certain death, or he could use them to present an impossible choice that might save the many at the cost of the one. The fealty that bound him to his lord and his community felt both a sacred pillar of his world and an unbearable weight upon his soul.
Brother Michael felt the siege not in the shudder of the walls, but in the dampness that had crept into his bones. It was a deep, persistent chill that no brazier could fully chase away, a consequence of hundreds of people living packed together, their breath and bodies adding a permanent moisture to the enclosed spaces of Oakhaven's lower levels. He noticed it first in his precious books, the parchment pages curling slightly as if recoiling from the touch of the stone. Then he saw it as a fine dark fuzz creeping into the corners of the infirmary, a mold that smelled of wet earth and decay. This unseen dampness, he was beginning to realize, was a far more insidious enemy than the one that threw stones, for it had already breached their highest walls and was making a fortress of its own within their lungs. This creeping wetness brought with it a sound, a dry, rattling cough that began in the crowded refugee quarters in the lower bailey.
At first, it was just 1 or 2 people, easily dismissed as a common chest cold. But then the sound multiplied, echoing from the barracks where the men-at-arms slept shoulder to shoulder. And soon he heard it from the kitchens and the stables. It was a persistent, nagging cough that stole a man's strength and left a woman gasping for breath. Consequently, the trickle of patients to his small infirmary became a steady stream, and then a flood. They came with the cough, but also with a heat behind their eyes and a weakness in their limbs that made holding a water bucket, let alone a spear, an impossible task. As a result, his small infirmary, once a quiet space of healing, transformed into a crowded chamber of misery. Cots lined every wall, and pallets covered the floor, forcing him to step carefully between the sick. The air, once scented with the clean smells of dried lavender and chamomile, now carried the sour odor of fevered sweat and sickness. He moved from one person to the next, his world shrinking to the needs of the body before him: a cool cloth for a burning forehead, a spoonful of honeyed water for a raw throat, a quiet prayer for a soul hovering between worlds. He saw the same progression in too many faces: the initial cough, the encroaching fever, the weakness, and then the unnerving stillness. His work was no longer about setting bones or stitching wounds from the enemy outside. It was a desperate battle against an enemy that had risen from within their own midst.
Because his stocks were so low, every decision became a painful calculation. His neatly organized clay jars of herbs, once plentiful, were now mostly empty. He had a small amount of willow bark left, precious stuff for fighting a fever. He found himself weighing one life against another. Should he give the last of it to the young guardsman, a strong man who might have the constitution to fight off the sickness on his own? Or should he offer it to the baker's young daughter, whose small body was being consumed by the fever, even though he feared it was already too late for her? He would stand over his grinding stone, his hands hesitating, the weight of his choice feeling heavier than any stone the trebuchets could hurl. Each dose he administered felt like a final, desperate wager. This struggle with his dwindling supplies led him to improvise. He sent boys to scrape moss from the northern walls, hoping a boiled concoction might soothe the cough, though he knew it was a flimsy hope. He instructed the cooks to boil all the drinking water, a tedious task that earned him grumbles. But he had noticed that those who drank from the upper well, closer to the keep, seemed to fare better than those who used the lower one near the crowded bailey. It was a flimsy connection, a thought he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to catch smoke in his hands. A visiting priest had told him the sickness was a test of faith, a divine judgment. Michael, however, wiping a sick child's brow, found himself wondering if the cause was more earthbound, perhaps carried on the foul smells that rose from the overflowing latrine pits. His most difficult moments came when he had to face Lord Edmund. The commander would visit the infirmary, his face a mask of concern, and ask for an accounting. "How many men are fit for the wall, Brother Michael?" he would ask, his voice low. Michael would have to give him the numbers, watching as the Lord's shoulders slumped with each report of another guard taken by the fever. The visible garrison was shrinking, not from arrows or swords, but from this quiet, relentless pestilence. He saw the toll it took on the healthy guards as well. Their fear was palpable as they carried their sick comrades to him, their eyes darting around the crowded room as if they could see the illness hanging in the air. One of the older guardsmen,
A man named Rolf, with a face like a worn leather shield, managed a grim joke as Michael checked his breathing. "I'd rather face a flight of arrows than this cough, brother," he rasped, his attempt at a smile turning into another fit of hacking. "At least an arrow is honest. You see it coming." Michael offered him a thin smile in return, but the man's words stuck with him. The honesty of the battlefield was gone, replaced by a hidden war fought in beds of straw. There was no glory in this fight, no honor in this kind of suffering. It was simply a slow, quiet draining of life from the heart of Oakhaven. The most frightening part was its indifference. The sickness did not care if you were a knight or a stable hand, a merchant's wife or a refugee's child. It moved through the castle's veins, respecting no rank, no wall, no prayer. It was the great leveler, accomplishing what Baron Valerius's army could not. The Baron's trebuchets could break their stone, but this unseen enemy was breaking their spirit. It frayed the bonds between people as the healthy began to shy away from the sick, and a simple cough in the courtyard could cause a ripple of fear, making people turn and walk away. The sense of shared struggle against a common foe was being replaced by a more personal, isolating terror. He found his own faith tested not by the enemy at the gates, but by the suffering within them. He recited the Psalms for the sick and the dying, his voice a low murmur in the crowded room, but the words sometimes felt hollow against the sheer scale of the misery. He was a healer whose hands were empty, a man of God watching his flock wither. He was exhausted, his own body aching with a weariness that went beyond muscle and bone. He kept working, driven by a duty that had become instinct, moving from one patient to the next, offering what little comfort he had left, a sip of water, a steadying hand, a promise that they were not alone. As the siege outside ground on, marked by the periodic crash of stone, the true siege within the walls intensified. The battle for Oakhaven was no longer being fought solely on the battlements with bows and spears. It was being fought in the dark, damp corners of the castle, in the fevered dreams of the sick, and in the quiet desperation of the man tasked with healing them. The enemy they could see was terrible, a force of wood and steel and shouting men. But the one they couldn't see was worse. It required no siege engine, asked for no surrender, and it was winning. In the growing dimness of the infirmary, Brother Michael carried the day's heavy burdens into a fitful, shallow rest. The first snowflake was a curiosity, a single white speck drifting down into the gray courtyard. Finn, a boy whose world had shrunk to the space between the gatehouse and the keep, watched it land and vanish on a damp cobblestone. Then another came, and another, until the air was a slow, silent swirl of white. Within an hour, the grime and misery of the long siege were hidden beneath a clean, deceptively soft blanket. The usual sounds of the castle, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of worried voices, the cries of gulls from the river, all grew distant, muffled by the falling snow. This new quiet was strange, a heavy stillness that felt more threatening than the war horns of the enemy. It was a silence that made every crunch of a boot, every cough from a huddled group seem unnaturally loud and exposed. This profound change in the soundscape brought with it an immediate and primal understanding that spread through the castle without a word being spoken. The enemy was no longer just the men in the camps beyond the walls. A new, more patient foe had arrived. People began to move with a different purpose. Their shoulders hunched not just from despair, but from a deep, penetrating chill that the stone walls seemed to amplify. Finn felt it in his bones, a cold that seeped through his thin wool tunic and made his fingers ache. He watched as his mother's face, already pale from hunger, took on a pinched bluish tint around her lips. The desperate need for warmth became the single overriding thought in every mind, a more immediate and pressing concern than the threat of Baron Valerius's army. Consequently, a new command was given, not by a knight from the battlements, but by a steward with a grim face. The children, being small and able to slip into forgotten spaces, were tasked with a new duty. They were to become fuel gatherers. Their world, already a prison, was now redefined as a forest of stone and decaying wood to be harvested. Finn joined a small group of boys and girls, their faces smudged with soot and fear, as they were pointed towards the abandoned merchant houses in the lower bailey. These were homes whose owners had either fled early or fallen to the sickness that had swept through the crowded halls. They were empty shells, monuments to a life that no longer existed within Oakhaven's walls. Finn's first target was a weaver's cottage, its door already hanging ajar. Inside, the cold was even more intense than in the open courtyard, a damp stillness that clung to the air. His hands, stiff and clumsy, fumbled with the wooden shutter on a small window. He had to use a loose stone to pry the planks free, the sound of splintering wood echoing loudly in the silent room. A part of him felt a deep sense of wrongness in this act. He was tearing apart someone's home, a place where a family had once lived and worked. Yet, the image of his younger sister shivering uncontrollably beneath a thin blanket pushed the feeling away. Survival had its own unforgiving set of rules, and they were simpler and harsher than any taught by a priest or a lord. As he worked, he pulled a long splinter into the palm of his hand, a sharp, biting pain that brought tears to his eyes. He stopped for a moment, sucking at the small wound, the taste of blood and dirt a familiar one. Looking out the empty window frame, he could see the enemy's camp across the snowy field. The Baron's forces were also suffering. Their tents sagged under the weight of the snow, and the smoke from their fires rose in thin, lazy columns. For a fleeting moment, Finn didn't see an army of monsters. He saw men huddled around fires, just as his own people were, fighting the same relentless cold. It was a strange and unsettling thought that their misery mirrored his own, a shared struggle against an enemy that favored neither side.
This realization, however, did little to ease his burden. The wood he had managed to break free was heavy and awkward to carry. He stacked the pieces, his breath coming in ragged white puffs. Each piece of dry, splintered timber felt more valuable than any silver coin he had ever seen. A coin could not stop a child shivering. It could not boil the thin, watery soup that was their only meal. But this wood, this broken piece of a stranger's window, could do both. It was the currency of life now, and he and the other children were the miners, digging it out from the ruins of their own community. He wondered how long they could sustain themselves by eating their own home, piece by piece. The journey back across the courtyard was a slow, difficult march. The snow was deeper now, clinging to his boots and making each step an effort. The precious wood dug into his shoulder, but he barely noticed the discomfort, his focus entirely on not slipping on the icy stones beneath the fresh powder. Other children were returning as well, dragging broken chair legs, cabinet doors, and even the carved posts of a dismantled bed. They looked like a procession of ants carrying away the fragments of a dying world, their small forms bent under the weight of their scavenged treasures. No one spoke. There was no energy to waste on words. Back in the crowded corner of the great hall that his family now called home, the wood was received with quiet, desperate gratitude. His mother carefully broke the larger planks into smaller pieces, her movements economical and precise. A small fire was kindled, and for a short while, a tiny circle of warmth pushed back the relentless cold. The family huddled close, their hands outstretched towards the small, flickering flames, the orange light casting deep shadows on their gaunt faces. The smell of burning pine filled their small space, a scent that was both comforting and a sad reminder of the forests that now seemed a world away. It was a temporary reprieve, a brief victory in a war that had no clear end.
As the small fire burned, the muffled boom of a trebuchet sounded from outside. It was a lazy, tired sound, nothing like the sharp, terrifying cracks of the autumn. The snow and the cold had slowed the enemy's assault, turning their relentless bombardment into a sporadic, almost half-hearted effort. The great machines, their wooden frames swollen and stiff with ice, could not work as they once had. The Baron's engineers were likely facing their own struggles with frozen ropes and brittle timber. This lull in the fighting was not a gesture of mercy, but a consequence of the shared hardship imposed by the season. The winter had, in its own impartial way, become Oakhaven's unlikely and unforgiving ally. This temporary shield, however, came at a great cost. The cold was a patient siege engine in its own right, one that attacked not the walls of the castle, but the bodies and spirits of the people within. It drained their strength, consumed their resources, and made every waking moment a struggle for simple survival. Finn watched the faces around the fire, seeing the deep, weary lines that hunger and cold had carved into them. Hope, which had flickered in the early days of the siege, had been reduced to a stubborn, animal instinct to see the next sunrise. The grand questions of loyalty and victory seemed to fade, replaced by a much simpler, more urgent question: would there be enough wood for tomorrow? Beyond their small circle of light, the great hall was a cavern of shivering shadows. Hundreds of people were packed into the space, their collected body heat doing little to warm the vast stone chamber. A low, persistent cough echoed from the darker corners, a reminder of the sickness that still lingered, now made worse by the damp chill. The bonds of community, already strained by hunger and fear, were now being tested by the simple, selfish need for warmth. A family with a small fire was a family with power, and Finn could feel the envious eyes of others watching their small blaze from the surrounding darkness. The small pile of wood dwindled quickly. Each piece added to the flames was a choice, a calculation of how much warmth they could afford now versus how much they would need to survive the long frozen night. When the last piece was laid upon the glowing embers, a collective sigh of resignation passed through the family. The brief period of comfort was over. The cold, which had been held at bay, began to creep back in, reclaiming its territory inch by inch. Finn pulled his thin blanket tighter around his shoulders, the meager fabric offering little protection against the deep chill emanating from the stone floor. He watched the last ember fade to black, leaving them in the shared darkness. Finn curled up beside his sister, the day's exhaustion settling over him like a heavy shroud. The next morning would demand its own fuel, its own bitter choices. The cruel chill of the stone floor worked its way through the thin straw pallet, a persistent thief stealing what little warmth remained. For Gregor, the tanner, this cold was a familiar enemy, one he had fought his entire life in the damp pits behind his workshop. But this was a different kind of cold, a deeper one that settled in the bones and hollowed out the spirit. It was the same cold he felt when he looked at his daughter, Elspeth, her small form a fragile mound under a threadbare blanket. Her breathing was a shallow, rattling sound, a rhythm of sickness that had become the constant, terrible music of their cellar room. The promises of loyalty, the stirring speeches from Lord Edmund about duty and honor, all felt like distant echoes from another world, a world where children did not waste away in the dark. This sense of detachment from the castle's greater cause grew sharper with each passing day. Gregor would climb the steps from his cellar into the bailey, and the world above seemed a performance he no longer understood. He would see knights polishing their armor, their movements slow from hunger, but still filled with a purpose he had lost. He would hear the guards on the wall call out to one another, their voices thin but resolute. They were all part of a great tapestry of defiance, a story being woven about the defense of Oakhaven. Yet, down in his damp corner of that story, the only reality was the gnawing emptiness in his stomach and the sound of his daughter's cough, a sound that unraveled every thread of allegiance he was supposed to feel. The watery broth they received each evening did little more than wet their throats, its taste a constant reminder of their slow starvation. One night, a muffled thud from the narrow alley behind his workshop broke the stillness. It was not the familiar, ground-shaking boom of the enemy's engines, but something small and close. Curiosity, a feeling he had not experienced in weeks, pulled him from his pallet. In the sliver of moonlight that pierced the gloom, he found a rock wrapped in dark cloth. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the knot. Inside was not a threat, but a promise scrawled on a piece of cured hide, the letters rough and urgent. It spoke of a way out. It asked for a simple thing, a mark, a piece of chalk on a cellar door near the south wall, a door that led to a section of the foundation known only to those who had lived their lives within these stones. In exchange, the message offered food and safe passage for his family when the walls finally came down. The piece of hide felt like a burning coal in his hand. He hid it beneath a loose stone in his floor, but he could not hide the words from his mind. For the next 2 days, they followed him, a constant, silent whisper against the backdrop of suffering. As he accepted his meager ration of broth, he looked into the weary eyes of the steward's man who served him. The man offered a tired, comradely nod, a small gesture of shared struggle. Gregor felt a hot shame rise in his chest, so potent it almost made him forget his hunger. This man and all the others were his people. They were Oakhaven. To betray them was to betray his own name, the memory of his father who had helped build these very walls. He was a part of this place, his identity bound up in its stone and soil.
Yet that evening, as he tried to coax Elspeth to drink a little of the broth, she turned her head away, too weak to swallow. Her hand, when he held it, was impossibly light, the bones as delicate as a bird's wing. In that moment, the faces of his neighbors, the stoic image of Lord Edmund on the battlements, and the proud banner of Oakhaven all faded into gray abstractions. They were ideas, but his daughter was real. Her suffering was a sharp physical pain in his own heart. The grand tapestry of honor and duty tore apart, leaving only one thread that mattered, the fragile cord that bound him to his child. The scholarly debates of lords and knights about the righteousness of their cause meant nothing against the simple, brutal fact of a father's love. His torment was a silent battle, waged in the darkest corners of the castle. He found himself studying the faces of the guards, men he had known since childhood. He saw the grim set of their jaws, the exhaustion etched around their eyes, and a part of him recoiled from the treachery he was considering. They were defending his home, his life. Then he would pass the makeshift infirmary, where Brother Michael worked tirelessly, and the low moans of the sick and wounded would reach him. He saw the community's strength, its will to endure, and felt like a worm burrowing into the heart of a great oak. But every path his thoughts took led him back to the cellar, back to the sound of that rattling breath. His loyalty to the community felt like a heavy cloak, but his duty to his child was his own skin. On the third night, he made his choice. The decision did not come with a crash of lightning or a surge of conviction. It was a quiet, cold settling in his soul, a final surrender to the inevitable. He waited until the deepest point of the night, when the castle was submerged in a profound silence, broken only by the wind's lonely cry over the merlons. He took a small nub of chalk he used for marking hides, its texture gritty and familiar against his palm. Slipping out of his cellar, he became a shadow, moving through other shadows. The cold of the night air bit at his exposed skin, and he pulled his thin tunic tighter, his own movements feeling sluggish and strange, as if he were walking through deep water. He found the cellar door easily, tucked away in a recess behind the empty mews. It was old and warped, the iron hinges rusted.
He had played near this very spot as a boy, a lifetime ago. For a moment he hesitated. The entire weight of Oakhaven, of its history and its people, seemed to press down on him. He saw the face of the guard who had shared a piece of his bread with him a month ago, a gesture that now seemed like a king's ransom. He heard the echo of Lord Edmund's voice, promising them all that their stand would be remembered. Then, from the direction of his own dwelling, a sound so faint it was merely lost in the wind, a child's weak cry. The sound broke his paralysis. With a steady hand, he drew a small white X on the rough wood, a stark symbol against the darkness. The mark seemed to glow with a sickly light of its own. It was a tiny thing, easily overlooked, but to Gregor it was a wound gashed into the heart of the castle. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling nothing, just a vast and hollow emptiness. He had traded a fortress for a chance, a community for a hope. Turning, he slipped back through the sleeping alleys, his footsteps making no sound. He did not look back. There was nothing more to see. The deed was done. The choice was made. The whisper in the dark had been answered. Back in the cellar, he lay down on the straw, the familiar cold seeping back into his limbs. He listened to his daughter's breathing, the sound that had driven him to this act. It had not changed. He had sealed the fate of hundreds, had betrayed men who trusted him, had broken an oath to his lord, and still the sickness held its ground. He closed his eyes. The image of the white X burned into his mind. He wondered if the food, when it came, would have any taste at all. A part of him felt like a murderer, while another, colder part, simply felt like a father. He did not know when the miners would start their work, only that he had shown them the way. The thought of the slow, methodical scraping from beneath the walls, a sound no one else would understand until it was too late, was a new kind of torment. He had traded one form of helplessness for another. He was no longer a victim of the siege, but its secret architect. His allegiance had shrunk from the size of a castle to the small space of a straw pallet, from the fate of a people to the life of one small child. Around the silent courtyards and along the frozen battlements, the great stone fortress of Oakhaven stood defiant against the winter night. The wind moved through its empty spaces, carrying on its ancient, mournful song. The guards kept their lonely watch, their gazes fixed outward on the enemy they could see, unaware of the one that had just been invited inside. The heart of the castle had been broken not by a trebuchet or a battering ram, but by a piece of chalk in the hand of a desperate man. The stones still stood, but the community had already begun to fall. It began not with a bang, but with a deep, unsettling groan from the very foundations of the world. Standing on the northern battlements, Lord Edmund felt the vibration travel up through the soles of his boots, a tremor that spoke of something ancient and solid giving way. For a moment, an unnatural quiet fell over the field, a collective held breath from both the besiegers and the besieged. Then, with a sound like a giant cracking his knuckles, the southern wall, the patch of mismatched stone that had stood for generations, slumped inward. A great cloud of gray dust billowed up, momentarily hiding the sky, and the silence was replaced by a triumphant roar from the enemy camp, a sound of pure, hungry avarice. His armor, once a symbol of strength, now felt like a cage of lead, each plate a separate weight pulling him toward the earth. Below, in the ranks of Baron Valerius's men, Rice felt the ground shudder and tasted the sudden grit of stone dust on his tongue. The signal horn blew, a raw, piercing note that cut through the lingering rumble of the collapse. The time for watching was over. He was no longer a shadow on a ridge, sketching walls and counting carts, but a man with a shield in one hand and a short sword in the other, part of a human tide surging toward the newly made gap. The air was a chaos of shouted orders and the thunder of thousands of running feet. He pulled the rough wool of his tunic up over his nose, a futile gesture against the choking cloud ahead. His world, once measured in leagues and days, had shrunk to the few feet of ground in front of him and the backs of the men he followed into the breach. Lord Edmund moved without conscious thought, his voice cracking as he bellowed for his men. "To the breach! Form a wall! Hold the breach!" The words were familiar from training and tales of old, but they felt strange and hollow now. He scrambled down the stone steps, his hand sliding along the cold, familiar wall that was no longer whole. In the courtyard, the last dregs of Oakhaven's strength gathered. He saw Sir Gareth, his face a mask of grim resolve, rallying the handful of remaining knights. But beside them stood others. A baker, his arms still pale with flour, holding a wood axe. The blacksmith, his massive hands wrapped around a hammer never intended for battle. And stable hands with sharpened pikes. They were not an army, but a community refusing to die on its knees. This desperate assembly met the first wave of attackers as they poured over the jagged mound of rubble. Rice was among them, his feet slipping on loose stones and broken timbers. He saw a defender's face for a split second, a man his father's age, with fear and fury warring in his eyes, before another attacker shoved past him. The fight in the breach was not a duel of champions. It was a bludgeoning, shoving match, a clumsy and brutal press of bodies. Rice parried a wild swing from a man wielding a broken piece of masonry, his own sword stroke going wide as someone stumbled into him from behind. He could hear nothing but a harsh mix of sounds, the grating of steel on stone, the wet thud of impacts, and the breathless grunts of men straining with all their might. From his position, just behind the line, Edmund saw the terrible arithmetic of the fight. For every one of Valerius's soldiers that fell, 2 more scrambled over the rubble to take their place. His people, however, were a finite resource. He watched the baker go down, his axe falling from his grasp, and saw 2 of the stable hands overwhelmed by a rush of men bearing the snarling wolf banner on their shields. The defenders were a small island, and the tide was rising around them. Yet, for a few desperate moments, they held. A merchant, whose arguments over grain had filled the courtyard with bitter words just weeks before, now stood shoulder to shoulder with a refugee farmer, their shared shield wall the only thing that mattered. As a result of this fierce, albeit brief, resistance, the initial assault wave faltered, becoming clogged in the narrow opening. Rice found himself pushed back down the slope of rubble by the sheer press of the defense. He saw a gap and scrambled sideways, using his hands to climb over a section of the ruined wall that was less congested. From this slightly higher vantage, he could see into the courtyard beyond the fight. He saw the commander, Lord Edmund, a tall figure in dark, unadorned armor, directing his men, his presence a clear anchor in the swirling chaos. For an instant, their eyes met across the distance, and Rice felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Not pity, but a strange recognition of the man whose home he was helping to destroy. That moment of connection was shattered as a second, larger wave of attackers, led by the brash cavalry captain Master Ulrich had once argued with, finally broke through the exhausted line of defenders. The fight spilled from the breach into the main bailey. The cohesive shield wall shattered into a dozen small, hopeless struggles. The community, so briefly united in its final stand, was broken apart. Lord Edmund found himself facing 3 soldiers at once, his sword a blur of motion born from years of training. He fought not for victory, which he knew was impossible, but for the principle of defiance, for the idea that Oakhaven would not be taken without a price.
Riss, now inside the walls, felt a profound sense of dislocation. This was the place he had studied for months, a map he knew by heart. Yet being inside it was completely different. The sounds were sharper, echoing off the stone keeps and halls. He saw a woman, perhaps the weaver's daughter Anwen, pulling a small child into a doorway, her face pale with terror. He saw the infirmary, its door splintered, and wondered about the fate of the man who tended its herbs. It was no longer a fortress to be analyzed, but a home being torn apart, and his own hands were among those doing the tearing. He lowered his sword, the fire for the fight suddenly draining from him. The struggle was brutally short. The superior numbers of the besieging army were simply too much to overcome. Sir Gareth fell near the main gate, his body shielding a young squire. The blacksmith fought until a spear from behind brought him to his knees. Lord Edmund, his breath coming in ragged gasps and his arm aching with the effort of the fight, was finally disarmed. The clang of his sword on the cobblestones, an alarmingly final sound. He stood straight, sweat and blood mingling on his face, as soldiers surrounded him, their spear points a forest of steel hemming him in. Across the courtyard, a soldier scrambled up the side of the gatehouse. He untied the faded banner of Oakhaven, with its stoic oak tree, and let it fall to the ground like a discarded rag. In its place, he raised the banner of Baron Valerius, the snarling black wolf on a field of blood red. It caught the breeze, snapping in the wind, a stark and brutal declaration of the new reality. The sounds of fighting died down, replaced by the shouts of the victors and the weeping of the vanquished. Oakhaven had fallen. Rise stood near the broken wall, his shield hanging heavy in his hand, and watched the new flag claim the sky. The weeks of observation, the meticulous planning, the building of the engines, the misery of the winter, the betrayal in the dark, it had all led to this single moment. He had played his part, providing the key that had helped unlock the gate. Yet there was no sense of triumph, only a vast and hollow weariness.
He had been a wolf, patient and hungry, and now the hunt was over. The taste of stone dust lingered in his mouth as Rise looked upon the ruin he had helped create. All the lines he had drawn on his parchment, all the routines he had memorized, had been transformed into this terrible, tangible breaking of a community. The siege was over, but for the people of Oakhaven, and perhaps for himself, the true cost was only just beginning to be counted. The scent of shattered rock and splintered wood hung over the courtyard as he reflected on all that had transpired. And so, our journey into the art of commanding a medieval siege concludes for tonight. Picture the commander's tent, long after the day's orders have been given. The great siege engines, the trebuchets and the towers, stand silent under a canopy of stars, their work done for now. Inside, by the soft glow of a single lamp, the heavy campaign maps are carefully rolled and put away. The intricate plans, the strategies for walls and wards are committed to stillness. This is the commander's quiet hour, a necessary peace before the dawn. Just as they must release the day's burdens and trust in the quiet watch of the sentries, you too can now set aside your own plans. Let the great efforts of your day settle. Allow the peaceful quiet of history's evening to envelop you. May your rest be deep and your dreams untroubled. Sleep well.